Hello my dear students, here's again your computer Wunsum. The most exciting thing about Dungeons & Dragons is still the battles. These fantasies that you manage to defeat strong or many opponents, and at the end of the battle you can stand over your downed enemies. This feeling that you have mastered this challenge together, although it would probably be impossible for each individual. Battle encounters have always been exciting, be it in video games, in movies or in books. And Dungeons & Dragons is no exception. However, with the fighting on the DM side, more questions arise. Can the group fight back against this group of goblins? Is it possible for the party to mow down this dragon, or is it too hard? And what about the consequences of a fight? There are different ways to win fights, and they usually ensure that the best experiences emerge from them. But how does the fighting become such a good experience? Here are 10 tips to make Dungeons & Dragons fights a memorable experience. Let's start with the basics. One of the most important factors in Dungeons & Dragons is the choice of creatures. What creatures best suit the encounter which I plan? And what creatures should not be used in these specific encounters in the first place? In the most ideal case, the encounters are adapted on the party. You have to make sure that you don't plan any encounters which are impossible for them. And to find the specific monsters necessary for your own encounters, you definitely have to use the monster manual or the World Wide Web. For instance, if you are in a horror campaign, it is great to use some skeletons or zombies. Or maybe you are in a more steampunky technical campaign, so maybe you should use robots in this case, like the autonomes, or maybe even these constructs, like golems and something like this. The choice of creatures is important not only for the different encounters, not only for the different battles, but also for the whole story. Make sure you have the monsters which are good for your own campaign. Maybe keep some surprises for yourself for a little bit later, but make sure that the party has the feeling that they really have accomplished something by using a variation of monsters. To make sure that you have the correct monsters, in fact, you need to look at the challenge rating. The challenge rating is an indicator on how hard or how easy an encounter will be. For instance, if a creature has a challenge rating of 3, this means that the party of 4 people, all of level 3, shouldn't have a problem with this monster. The idea behind the challenge rating is especially for beginners to make sure that you have encounters which are good enough for your party. If the challenge rating for the monster is too high, for instance, then the party can't handle it and they have to flee. If the challenge rating is too low, it doesn't feel as epic as if they have beaten real monsters. As an example, there's the aforementioned skeleton, which for instance has a challenge rating of 1/4. This means that the party of level 1 of 3 or 4 people can handle a skeleton without any problems. However, for instance, the manticore with a challenge rating of 3 is a little bit harder to handle, and as I said before, you need usually a party of 4 people, all with level 3 to handle the manticore. And to make sure to have even a specific combination of monsters, you can use the Dungeons & Dragons encounter calculator. In the description of the video there will be a link, but in short, this encounter calculator looks at the challenge rating or the experience points of the monsters and calculates the difficulty rating for the party depending on the number of monsters and number of party members and their levels. However, you don't have to keep attacking with only one single monster. Make some variations. Make it that some enemies may be a little bit stronger and some are not as strong as the others. For instance, make an army of goblins or orcs which are led by an ogre. Or maybe a goblin keeper who has the task of working with some wolves. You can connect them even with some specific preferences. Maybe that when the goblin is dead, the wolves are fleeing. Or maybe that you can befriend the wolves and then they attack the goblin. All of these are possibilities to end an encounter, not only by fighting, but also by making the enemies cleverer. For instance, make the wolves attack in the pack. By using the pack tactics feature of the wolves, you can make sure that the wolves always have advantage. Or maybe the goblin gets so arrogant that he makes mistakes. Make combat encounters so that the players can play them a little bit smarter. Even if this combat encounter won't happen as you planned, it is always a good idea to keep it like this, because this keeps the party motivated. As you can see, you can make some variations in the fights themselves, but you can also make some variations in the environment they are fighting in. If the party is at the ocean and they are wandering around some cliffs, if they have a narrow path where this is the only path for them to go, then you can use it as a very good obstacle to make sure that the party has to watch every single step they are doing. However, they also can use these obstacles for their own possibilities. If they have an encounter at these cliffs, then they can, for instance, drop down any enemies who are way too clumsy to be on this narrow path, for instance. But you don't have to keep it only on the background or on the environment. It is also possible to use some interactable objects like different mechanisms, maybe some potions which are just laying there, or maybe some barrels. Everyone knows, for instance, about the red barrel, that if you shoot on it with fire, then it explodes. This is an example you can use for your own adventures. You also can use a boulder which the party can use to keep the enemies at bay. Or something like a weird machine the party doesn't recognize exactly, but realizes that it destroys their opponents. Or the opponents can realize that it damages the party. All of these are very easy examples to implement in your own campaign. And you can see that they are always useful for anything you can do in your own adventures. However, it technically doesn't have to be only in the battlefield in this case. There's always the possibility to use some other events or other surprises which keep the fights dynamic. For instance, your party is attacking the goblin army and reduces it to 2 to 1 of these goblins, until after a few minutes a cavalry of other goblins arrives. Or it's the same if a gigantic dragon is attacking and hunting the party, and the party needs to flee, and they are going to be saved by a friendly vampire or something like this. By using little surprises you can make the fight so much more interesting, in fact. For instance, the party has only a specific amount of time, or some bombs explode in the town, which could destroy the whole city where they are in at the moment. And if they don't stop them, then they are losing the town and losing all of the people they like there. And as you can see, these events don't have to be in the disadvantage of the party, as the vampire example shows. Events make sure that the party realizes that there is more than the battlefield in this world in itself. So if they see that something happens outside, then they realize, okay, it is much more important that they have to win this fight. This brings me also to the next point with the stakes. What do we have to fight for? What is the important goal we have to reach when we are fighting with this? Is it only about survival, or maybe something much more bigger, much more dangerous, or much more ultimate than the things we are working with? Encounters should have a specific purpose in this case. You have to make sure that the combat is important for the party, even if it's of small importance in some cases. It can be that their own lives are at stake, or maybe even like with the bomb example before, it's about the whole city that would be demolished if the party can't find the bombs or can't stop the bomb layer of exploding them. However, you cannot create those stakes only with encounters. Make sure that the NPCs are somewhat connected to the battles, maybe that they have some influence on them, and maybe that the party feels that influence. Maybe by saving them that they feel better in this case. And the higher the stakes for the party, the more they are invested in the adventure and the more they feel like that they can move something in it. But like in every encounter, it can't be that everything works as planned, in fact. In Dungeons and Dragons it is very possible that something doesn't go as planned or that something goes wrong. Mistakes happen. Even for you as a dungeon master, if you have played for 10 years or even just starting, mistakes happen in every encounter. Maybe it is too weak and the party just rolls over it, or maybe it is too strong than you have planned it, that the party gets defeated or they have to flee, or maybe they can even find another great solution. Even if you plant the perfect encounter with the perfect challenge rating of easy or trivial, it is still possible that the party can't handle the whole situation because of some bad dice rolls, bad decisions, or maybe something else that you haven't planned for your adventures. I like to call this the invincible goblin theory, where you have already finished all of the monsters, but there is still this small single goblin who just doesn't want to be defeated. And the combination of bad dice rolls on the players and good dice rolls on the goblin will make exactly this goblin invincible. But just because it is a dice roll failure doesn't mean you can't work with it. In fact, as lucky as the goblin is, you can make him to a new hero, or the party can talk to him, thus improving the story of the whole campaign. And for the ultimately worst case, if one of the party members dies, make their death feel important. What I mean by this is usually when one of the party members dies, they don't success in their final death saving roll and they just die according to the rules. However, this doesn't feel epic. This doesn't feel like something they have finished. Make them play out how they die. Maybe they can do something more like a heroic sacrifice or something like this, where they beat up the most dangerous monster in the encounter you are having. Or maybe they make a final shout which motivates all of the other player characters to fight and go on in their battles. As tragic as a player character death is, a character death is a final moment for the player and the player character to show what the character can finally do. In this case, you as a DM are definitely allowed to bend the rules to make the most out of it and make sure that the player has a memorable outcome of this final fight. The 8th point goes in a little bit of another direction. Use some allies and some nemesis in your encounters. It is a fact that the party is much more motivated to save their own allies and to make sure that the evildoers they are encountering are getting their comeuppance. To make some connections inside and outside of the battlefield, make sure that the party has someone they like, someone they trust, and name as their ally. By having allies on the battlefield, the party knows that they have someone they can trust and they can work with. And they maybe even come up with some extra bonuses for the party. On the other hand, you can create a so-called nemesis, a creature or an enemy which the party can despise or which the party is scared of or something like this. Maybe an encounter they couldn't beat, or maybe someone so despicable that it becomes the main goal to the players to see this evildoer fall. This way you can also incorporate the backstory of the players, in fact. For instance, if they have some guy who has wronged them, they have now a possibility to get revenge for this. Or on the other hand, the party members are getting back to their village where they were loved beforehand and get cheered afterwards because one of the party members has lived in the village. This gives players the feeling that the backstory is in fact very important, and they think that the dungeon master also respects them this way. Another form of respect can also be obtained by giving them different treasures, especially built for the specific characters. So many things in Dungeons & Dragons can be considered as treasures. Maybe just the simple things like getting some gold which they can use to buy a little bit better equipment, or maybe some magic items they have found, to very special things especially made for some of the characters. For instance, spell scrolls, potions, magic items, or even some weapons. Make sure that the party can in fact use these different treasures, even if it's just gold for selling. The idea behind these treasures and these magic items especially is that the party can use some creative ways to make sure that they survive and win the adventure in their cases. One of my parties got once a decanter of endless water after they finished one of the quests I gave them. One of the party members used the decanter of endless water, filled the whole room with water in fact, and the wizard shot a lightning bolt in it, defeating all of the enemies in the process. This was just one example of usage for the magic items, for the treasures they got beforehand, and how they can handle them in the adventure in itself. However, this with the decanter of endless water isn't perfectly rules accurate. and this is the last point I want to make, because you can use the so-called rule of cool. It simply means if the players plan something cool, they can do it more or less. It always depends on the specific factors on what this cool in fact is, but if it sounds cool, then the DM can say that this is allowed. As a dungeon master, you make the rules more or less, and if the rules aren't clear, allow the coolest options in these cases, because this creates moments which are awesome, which are great, and which they keep for the rest of their life in the most ideal case. As a teacher, I love the rule of cool, because it shows me that the players are in fact not only creative but also invested in the story, and they have the feeling that if they do it like this, they can feel much more heroic and much more epic than they are usually without this rule of cool. Use this cool on your own discretion though. If you follow the rules on 100%, it can be a little bit problematic, but I also incline you, if you think that the action of the player is awesome, then allow it sometimes. Not always, but if it makes sense, then you can definitely allow it, because then they have the feeling that they can influence the story in their own ways. And with these words, I finish this video of 10 tips planning Dungeons & Dragons encounters. I can't wait to see or hear about your beautiful encounters, and I hope that this video could have helped you. Your Computer Wunsam.